The credit card statement was open on my laptop. My husband was supposed to be in Calgary for a leadership conference. 3 days, maybe 4. I'd kissed him goodbye at the door on a Thursday morning, watched his Uber pull out of our driveway in Mississauga, and then gone back inside to make lunches for the kids. That was the last normal moment I remember. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. We share a joint account for household expenses, and I was trying to figure out why our grocery budget looked off for the month. I logged into TD online banking the way I did every second Sunday, coffee going cold beside me, kids watching something on the iPad in the other room. The charge that stopped me wasn't big. It was $47.80 at a restaurant in Kelowna. My husband was supposed to be in Calgary. Kelowna is 4 hours away from Calgary by car. It's not a quick detour, it's not a wrong turn. I sat there for a long moment, reading the line again. Restaurant in Kelowna, Thursday evening. The same Thursday he'd flown out. I didn't call him. I don't know why exactly, other than something in my chest told me not to. Some animal instinct that said, wait, don't let him know you know, not yet, not until you understand what you're looking at. I closed the laptop and finished packing the lunches. We'd been together for 9 years. Married for 6. We have 2 kids. Our son is 10, our daughter is 7. We live in a semi-detached house in Mississauga that we bought 3 years ago, which is still a miracle to me, given what the market looked like when we started looking. My husband works in corporate procurement for a pharmaceutical company. Good salary, good benefits, lots of travel. I'm a registered dental hygienist. I work 4 days a week at a clinic in Port Credit, which I chose specifically because the hours let me do school pickup. We were, by most measures, fine. Good, even. That's the part that breaks me a little, even now. We weren't struggling. We weren't fighting constantly. There wasn't some obvious crack I should have seen. Our life looked, from the outside, like a life. After the kids were in bed that Thursday night, I went back to the statements. Not just the joint account this time. We each have a personal account. Just for our own spending, nothing dramatic, an arrangement we'd had since before we got married. And I knew his login because he'd asked me to transfer money into it once, when he was traveling, and I'd saved the credentials without really thinking about it. I sat at the kitchen table and I went back 6 months. By midnight, I had a picture I didn't want to have. There were weekend charges in cities he'd never mentioned visiting. There were hotel stays, nice ones. Not work trip budget nice, but genuinely nice. In Whistler, in Victoria, in a place called Tofino that I knew he'd always wanted to go to, that we'd talked about going to together someday. There were flower deliveries, restaurant charges on dates he'd told me he was working late, a recurring e-transfer every 3 weeks, to an account I didn't recognize, always the same amount, $800. $800 every 3 weeks for at least 5 months that I could see. I did the math. I stared at the number. Then I closed the laptop again and I went and stood in my kids' doorways for a while, listening to them breathe. I didn't sleep. The next morning I called in a personal day. I told my husband, when he texted to say good morning, that everything was fine and the kids were great. Then I called my oldest friend, someone I've known since we were in grade 7 together in Brampton, someone who knows every version of me that has ever existed, and I asked her if she knew a private investigator. She didn't. But she knew someone who did, and by 11 that morning, I was on the phone with a firm out of Toronto that had been recommended twice over. I told the investigator what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment, then he asked me a few questions. Did my husband have a predictable schedule? Did I have access to his location sharing? Had I noticed changes in his behavior over the past year? I thought about the behavior question for a long time before I answered. He'd been going to the gym more. He'd upgraded his phone without telling me, and the new one had a passcode I didn't know. He'd started being particular about his shirts, not dramatically, not in a way I'd flagged at the time, but looking back, yes. He cared about how he looked in a way he hadn't before, or maybe he'd just stopped not caring, which is a different thing. I said, yes, all of those things, yes. The investigator said he'd be in touch. I spent the rest of that day doing things that needed doing. I answered emails. I folded laundry. I helped my daughter with her reading log and listened to my son tell me about some drama with his friend group at school, something about a Roblox server and someone not being invited. I cooked dinner. I did all of it on autopilot, moving through the house that I had picked the paint colors for, that had my grandmother's quilt folded over the arm of the couch, that smelled like the candle I always kept on the kitchen windowsill. This is still my home, I kept thinking. Whatever this is still my home. My husband came back from his conference on Sunday. He brought the kids those little bags of old Dutch chips that you can get at gas stations, and he hugged me at the door, and he looked me in the eye, and he said he'd missed us. I hugged him back. I looked over his shoulder while I was hugging him, at the quilt on the couch, and I thought, you have no idea what's coming. The investigator sent me a preliminary report 10 days later. I was at work when the email came in. I was between patients. I read it in the supply room with the door closed, standing next to a shelf of disposable bibs and tooth polishing paste. My husband had not been at a leadership conference in Calgary. He had driven, not flown, driven, which is why there were no flight charges, to Kelowna, where a woman lived in a condo in the South Pandosi neighborhood. The investigator had photographs, my husband's car in her parking lot, my husband coming out of her building with coffee cups, casual, like a man who knew the door code, who had been there many times before. My husband and this woman walking along the waterfront on a Friday afternoon, her hand in the crook of his arm. There was one more thing. The investigator included it almost as an aside, in the second-to-last paragraph of his report. The woman appeared to be visibly pregnant. I put my phone in my coat pocket. I washed my hands at the sink. I went back out and called in my next patient, and I cleaned their teeth for 45 minutes, and I made notes in their file, and I scheduled their next appointment, and I said goodbye. And I did not cry until I was in my car in the parking lot at the end of my shift, and then I cried until I couldn't anymore. Then I called my friend, and then I called a lawyer. The lawyer my friend found me was a family law specialist in downtown Toronto, a woman who had been practicing for over 20 years. She had the kind of calm that isn't coldness. She wasn't detached, she was precise. There's a difference. She listened to everything I said without interrupting, and then she asked me several very specific questions about our assets, our mortgage, my husband's income, my income, and what, if anything, was in my name alone. Some things were in my name alone. Not by design, exactly. My husband had always been more relaxed about financial organization than I was, and over the years I'd ended up being the one who actually dealt with our accounts, our insurance, our RRSP contributions, our RSPIC for the kids. I knew where everything was. I knew what everything was worth. The lawyer noted this. She said, "Do not move anything yet. Do not tell him what you know, and do not stop documenting." I asked her what I was looking at, in terms of the divorce itself. In Ontario, she explained, matrimonial property is divided on the basis of net family property. What you came in with, what you accumulated during the marriage. The matrimonial home has specific rules. Regardless of whose name it's in, both spouses have equal possession rights. But that didn't mean the split would be simple. The $800 monthly transfers, she called it dissipation of marital assets, his using joint funds to support another woman and potentially another child. That mattered. The pregnancy mattered too. If the child was his, he would have legal obligations to that child that would affect his available income for support. If I could document that marital funds had gone towards supporting his affair partner, that was relevant to the property settlement. She told me to get the investigator to keep working. I did. Over the next 3 weeks, I was a person who had not received that email. I made dinner. I drove the kids to their activities. My son has hockey on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My daughter has gymnastics on Wednesday afternoons. I chatted with my in-laws when they called. My mother-in-law called every Sunday, and we'd always gotten along reasonably well, or I'd thought we had. She asked me how the kids were, how work was, how I was holding up with my husband traveling so much. I said, "We're managing. You know how it is." She said, "He works so hard, you're so patient." I thought about the investigator's photos. I thought about the condo in Kelowna. I said, "I really am." The second report came 4 weeks after the first. My husband had made another trip to Kelowna. He'd told me it was a vendor visit in Vancouver, 2 nights. Nothing exciting. The investigator documented him at the woman's condo building at a medical appointment clinic. The investigator noted the signage identified it as an obstetrics and maternal health clinic, and at a baby supply store where he spent over $300. $300 at a baby store. While his own kids were home with me, eating the dinners I cooked, sleeping under the roofs I'd helped choose tile samples for. I forwarded the report to my lawyer. She said, "We're ready when you are." I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about my son, who still sometimes came and sat on my bed on Saturday mornings with a book, leaning against my shoulder without even really thinking about it, just because that's where he wanted to be. I thought about my daughter, who had recently announced very seriously that she wanted to be a marine biologist, and who had proceeded to tell me 16 consecutive facts about orcas over dinner. I thought about what their lives were going to look like after this, and I felt something that wasn't grief exactly. Grief was too soft a word. It was something colder and harder, the recognition of damage that couldn't be undone. But I also thought about what it would mean to stay, to keep being a person who did not know what she knew. I couldn't do it. I wasn't built for it. I called my lawyer on a Thursday morning. I said, "Let's start." We filed the application for divorce on a Friday afternoon. My lawyer had advised me to do a few things first. I had already opened a personal bank account at a different institution. Not to hide money, she was clear about that would create problems, just to have somewhere that was entirely mine. I had gathered documentation, bank records, the investigator's reports, credit card statements going back 8 months, records of all the e-transfers. I had made copies of everything and stored them with my lawyer and with my friend. I told my husband the same evening he came home from work. I did it in the kitchen, after the kids were at my parents' place for the weekend. I'd arranged that in advance, told my mom I needed a couple of nights. She didn't ask why because she knows me well enough to understand that I will tell her things when I'm ready to tell her. I had printed the investigator's reports. I'd put them on the kitchen table. I'd made myself a tea because I needed something to do with my hands, and I stood there when he walked in the door and I said, "I think you should sit down." He looked at the papers before he sat. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt, not exactly, but the look of a person who has been running a calculation and just realized the numbers no longer add up. He sat down. I told him what I knew. I was calm. I'd practiced being calm. I told him about the bank records, about the investigator, about Kelowna, about the e-transfers, about the maternity clinic. I told him that our lawyer had filed that afternoon. He said things. He said several things, that it wasn't what it looked like, that he'd been going to end it, that he was sorry, that he loved me, that he loved the kids, that he'd never meant for this to happen. He cried. I watched him cry and I felt something I still can't fully name. Not satisfaction, not pity either. Something flat and very clear like a room with all the furniture moved out of it. I said, "I know about the baby." He went quiet. I said, "I need you to find somewhere to stay tonight. The kids will be back Sunday. I'd like you to be gone before then." He went upstairs. I heard him moving around. He came back down with a bag. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at me, and I thought he was going to say something more, but he didn't. The door closed. His car started. He left. I sat at the kitchen table with my cold tea and I looked at the room around me and I thought, this is still my home. The months that followed were hard in ways I hadn't fully anticipated and also easier in ways I hadn't expected. The legal process was slow and bureaucratic and sometimes maddening. We went through a period of negotiations that my lawyer navigated and that I participated in by answering questions and signing things and trusting the process even when it felt like standing still. My husband had hired his own lawyer. There were discoveries and disclosures, and more than one conversation I had to have sitting across the table from a man who had once put my grandmother's quilt over me when I fell asleep on the couch. The e-transfers were documented as dissipation of marital assets. The equalization calculation reflected them. The settlement was not what my husband had hoped for. The matrimonial home was addressed as part of the overall net family property division. I did not have to sell the house immediately. Under Ontario law, we worked out an arrangement, formalized in the agreement, that allowed me to stay with the kids and manage a buyout over time, with my husband receiving his share of the equity on a negotiated timeline. My lawyer had been thorough. More thorough than he'd expected, I think. His child with the woman in Kelowna was born in the spring. I know this because my son found out. Not from me, I never said a word about any of it to the kids beyond what they needed to know, which was that their dad and I weren't going to be married anymore, and that we both loved them and that none of this was their doing. But kids find out things. My son is 10 and he has ears and an internet-connected device. He came to me one evening, a few months after everything was settled, and said he'd heard from his dad that there was a baby. He sat down at the kitchen table in the same chair his father had sat in that night. And he said, "Are you okay, Mum?" He's 10 years old. I sat down across from him and I told him the truth. Which was that yes, I was okay, and that it was complicated, and that none of the complicated parts were his job to carry. I told him he was allowed to feel whatever he felt about it. I told him his little sister might have questions too, and that it was all right to just say, "I don't know," when she asked things neither of us could answer yet. He nodded. He's so serious sometimes, my son. He looks at me with this expression that is too old for his face and too young for what's behind it, he said. I just think it's not fair, I said. You're right, it isn't. He said, are we going to be okay? I said, yes, I really think we are. My daughter asked about the baby once briefly, the way she asks about things she's not sure how to categorize yet. She said, so we have a brother or a sister somewhere, and I said yes, a half-sibling, and she said, oh, and then she went back to telling me about orcas. I love her so much, both of them. They are the clearest thing in my life. It's been almost a year now. The house smells like the same candle on the windowsill. My grandmother's quilt is still on the couch. My son's hockey bag lives by the front door in a way that technically violates several household rules, but that I've stopped fighting. My daughter's marine biology drawings cover most of the fridge. I went back to full-time hours at the clinic in January. It helped to be busy. It helped to have something that was mine, that had always been mine, that no version of the past 2 years could take away from me. My mother-in-law called me once, after everything was public, after the divorce was filed. She wanted to talk. She said she hadn't known. I don't know whether that's true. I've decided I'm not going to spend energy on that question, because there's no answer I can verify, and there's no version of the answer that changes anything for me. I told her I was doing fine, and I wished her well, and I meant it, and then I said goodbye, and I hung up, and I went and helped my daughter practice her spelling words. My lawyer sent me a note when everything was finalized. She said I'd handled a very difficult process with clarity and pragmatism. She said the kids were lucky to have me. I keep that note, not in a dramatic way, not framed or anything, just in a folder in my desk drawer. On the days when this has all felt like too much, and there have been those days, more than I'd like, I've opened that drawer and remembered that someone professional and calm and precise looked at the whole picture and said, you did this right. I don't know what my husband's life looks like now. We communicate through our lawyers when we have to, and directly only about the kids' schedules, briefly, by text. He sees them every other weekend and some holidays. They go, they come back, they seem to love him and to find the arrangement complicated, and to be mostly okay. I think they will keep being okay. I think the thing kids need most is one parent who is fully present, and I am here, in this house, with the candle on the windowsill and the quilt on the couch and the hockey bag by the door. I'm 33 years old. My grandmother used to say that the worst things that happen to you are also the things that show you exactly what you're made of. I used to think that was just something people said. I understand it now.